Alright guys, welcome to the video for Reconstruction. This should help you review for the quiz tomorrow. Hopefully, you feel confident after watching this. So here we go. First thing we gotta talk about is sort of what Reconstruction is. And what you need to know is Reconstruction is the time period directly after the Civil War, and it's specifically about the South, right? Because most of the fighting that happens in the Civil War happens in the South. And the South also faced the heaviest losses, the heaviest loss of life, the heaviest loss of infrastructure and homes, and everything was destroyed in the South. So when we are talking about Reconstruction, it's about rebuilding the South, okay? Specifically, when we talk about Reconstruction, we need to know that Reconstruction is referring to two different types of Reconstruction. There is the physical Reconstruction, which is this right here. Sorry, I thought I had a highlighter. Physical Reconstruction, that's like the buildings, the fixing the factories, the railroads, all of that stuff. And then there's also the social Reconstruction. And when we're talking about social Reconstruction, we're talking about integrating into society the freedmen, the former slaves, right? And so what is their life going to be like? Because they went from being slaves to not being slaves, and how are they going to, make a living? How are they going to support their families? Where are they going to live? All of those kinds of things. And so that is going to be a big change in Southern society. And so there's sort of economic changes. They're going to have to pay people to work on their farms now. And so that's going to lead to a lot of changes. So the South is changing in lots of different ways and facing lots of different problems after the Civil War. In order to help the freedmen, the federal government creates this thing called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau is set up to provide, at first, immediate relief. Things like food, shelter, clothing, the things that you need to survive. And then over time, the long-term goals of the Freedmen's Bureau kind of change. They start to focus on education. And they start setting up a lot of schools specifically for the former slaves. Because remember, under slavery, the slaves were not allowed to learn how to read or write. They weren't allowed to, have any kind of education at all. And so now we are going to have this whole, class of, people, adults and stuff that can't read. And if you can't read, it's hard to sort of make a living or to make sure that people are not taking advantage of you in society. And, you have to be able to read to vote, to participate in the government, all of these things. So they wanted to help these people, and so that's the Freedmen's Bureau. You do want to know that it didn't just help the freedmen, it also did help some of the poor white people as well, okay? So that's going to be important. And then we talked about how today there are still universities that are famous for being started by the Freedmen's Bureau in Atlanta. So like Morehouse College in Atlanta, we said that Martin Luther King Jr., that's him right here as a young man, he was a graduate of Morehouse College. There's also Clark University in Atlanta, which was also established by the Freedmen's Bureau. So we have those schools here in Georgia still to this day. The next thing we got to talk about is sharecropping and tenant farming, and I'm actually going to explain this, but I'm just going to go to this slide right here with the photo of it, okay? So if you remember, we said that with the black codes, which were those laws, those discriminatory laws that were set up for the slaves, or the former slaves, I should say, one of the requirements for the former slaves, or laws against them, was that they had to work in agriculture. So a lot of the freedmen are going to get caught up in this system called sharecropping or tenant farming. And they're almost the same thing, but there is a couple of key differences. So remember that when it comes to sharecropping, the idea is that you are going to have a rich guy who's going to be trying to take advantage of the poor guy, right? And the way this works is that the poor guy, who is usually probably a former slave, would go to the rich guy and say, I'm going to work on your land. I need a job. And the rich guy is going to say, okay, we can do that. I'll give you land. I'll give you seeds for the land. I'll give you animals and tools, everything you need, right? And in exchange, when everything is said and done at the end of the year, we will split the profit for the crops 50-50. But that never actually happened, because the next thing that would happen is the rich guy would try to get the sharecropper or the tenant farmer into debt. And the way that he would do that is he would offer them things. They would say, how about, do you and your family, you need food, you need clothes, you need medical supplies? Well, the sharecropper might go and, or not the sharecropper, the rich guy would maybe go and get those supplies pretty cheap. You know, he's going to the store and buying them, paying whatever they cost. And then he's going to charge those things to the sharecropper at a higher price, okay? And the idea is that now when the sharecropper is done growing the crops, he's not going to get 50% of the money. The idea is that to get that guy into so much debt that the sharecropper is going to get zero, so he's working for free. So let's continue on the cycle, right? The rich guy offers to give the poor guy the things he needs, right? Sharecropper grows the crops, that's step 3. Then they harvest the crops and bring them to market and sell them. However, at this point, step 5, the rich guy has said, okay, we sold everything, here's how much money we've made, but that 50% you were supposed to get, that's just not going to cover the food, the medical supplies, the clothing, whatever it is that you got from him. And so now you're in debt. And in order to pay off that debt, you have to work for me next year for free until you have paid off your debt, right? And so the idea is that you're going to get this guy so into debt that eventually he's working for free, and that means that he's going to be a slave, okay? And this mostly happened to the former slaves, but this did happen to the poor white farmers as well, okay? So that's going to be important. Now, what you do need to know is the difference between a sharecropper and a tenant farmer is that the tenant farmer brought a little bit more to the table besides just his labor. He brought his own tools, maybe he had his own animals, maybe he could afford his own seeds, but the sharecropper brought nothing but their own labor. So the tenant farmer might be able to start off getting a better deal, but all it took was one bad year where you got behind, and then you might have fallen into sharecropping instead of tenant farming, okay? So that's going to be important. Next thing, remember that when the Civil War ends, president at the time, Abraham Lincoln, but he doesn't live for very long, right? Just a couple weeks after the war, he gets killed by John Wilkes Booth. But before Lincoln's killed, he does have a plan for Reconstruction that we call the presidential plan. Okay, so that's Lincoln's plan. And his vice president, Andrew Johnson, despite the fact that, you know, Andrew Johnson's a Southerner and all of that, is going to try to follow Abraham Lincoln's plan, right? Because Lincoln did not want to punish the South, right? He wanted a easy, you know, come back into the Union, we're not going to punish you, but there are 2 things you have to do, all right? So the presidential plan has 2 parts. Part 1 says that all adult men, not at all, I shouldn't have said that, I should say 10% of your adult male population has to take an oath. Put your hand on the Bible, say that you won't ever secede again, you're going to uphold and follow the Constitution, you're good to go. And then the other thing you had to do was ratify the 13th Amendment. So 10% take an oath, ratify the 13th Amendment, and you could come back into the Union. And that is a very light punishment, considering all of the death and destruction that the South kind of got blamed for because of the Civil War, right? But Lincoln knew that if we tried to punish the South, that could lead to resentment, that could lead to wars in the future. You know about things like that when we talked about like World War II, how it was caused because of how bad the Allies treated Germany after World War I, right? So Lincoln did not want something like that to happen. And so he said, we're going to treat the South as, you know, friendly as we can, but slavery's got to end, so that's a big deal to the South. But we want to treat them as friendly as we can, all right? However, when Lincoln dies, Andrew Johnson becomes president, and Andrew Johnson doesn't have the same influence or pull or popularity, however you want to say it, of Abraham Lincoln. And so basically, Andrew Johnson is, you know, going to be fighting with Congress constantly, because in Congress, the Republicans were kind of mad at Lincoln. They said, Lincoln, you should want to punish the South. You know, you just were president during this horrible war. We should treat the South like a conquered people. But Lincoln, because he was a Republican and they respected him, he was able to kind of control the Republicans' sort of tempers a little bit, stop them from trying to punish the South. But when Lincoln dies, Andrew Johnson can't do that. And so the radical Republicans kind of take control of Congress. And now we're going to start to see the South being sort of punished more harshly than Lincoln would have wanted, okay? So this is just talking about Abraham Lincoln dying and Johnson becoming president, so we're just going to skip that. All right, so what made the radical Republicans so angry? So first thing that the southern states tried to do, before they were all readmitted into the Union, the South did send some people to Congress, to the federal Congress, to represent them. And this was before the Confederate leaders didn't have their citizenship anymore. And the South started electing people like Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, and people like that to be in Congress. And obviously, they just fought a civil war, and now you're sending Confederate leaders over to represent your state. That wasn't going to fly. And so the Northerners threw those Confederates out of office and said, send someone else who wasn't, one of the people helping to cause the Civil War, even though Alexander Stephens really did try to prevent the Civil War. But that made them angry, that they sent these Confederate leaders to Congress. The other thing that made them mad was the Black Codes, right? They felt like the South was going out of their way to treat the former slaves wrong, right? And so with the Black Codes, it said that black people and white people couldn't get married. That's horrible. It said that the only jobs that black people could have in the South was with agriculture. It also said that a black person couldn't serve on a jury or offer testimony in court. So what that would mean is, like, let's say a black person was accused of a crime. If they couldn't have any black people on the jury, it was going to be an all-white jury. You're in the South in the 1860s. That's not going to be an impartial, fair jury, okay? And so that was, basically dooming these men to having unfair trials. And if you couldn't testify in court against a white person, then that means that a white person could commit a crime against a black person, and the black person couldn't get up in court and say that's the person who did it, or, offer proof against that person. So that is going to be a huge, huge mess for African Americans in the South. And the radical Republicans are going to want to try to prevent that from happening, right? And so here's what happens. Abraham Lincoln is killed. Andrew Johnson is in office. And Andrew Johnson, remember, is a Southerner that Lincoln put as his vice president to kind of extend an olive branch to the South. Well, what happens is he's never supposed to be president. He's kind of pro-slavery. He did stay with the Union during the war, though. And so the South doesn't like Andrew Johnson, and he doesn't want to punish the South because he's a Southerner, and they do. And so they start fighting. Congress would pass a law, Johnson would veto it. Johnson would veto a law, and they would override it. He had the most vetoes of any other president at his time. I think other presidents have passed that since. And Congress had the most overrides of vetoes. So it's just telling you that they're constantly fighting. Well, what happens is Andrew Johnson actually gets impeached by Congress. Now remember, being impeached just means you're accused of a crime. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've been convicted, found guilty, or even removed from office. You have to be impeached to begin the removal of a president. So what happens is Andrew Johnson would fire people from his cabinet, okay? And the Congress decides they're going to pass a law that says that Andrew Johnson has to get approval from Congress to fire people in his cabinet. The cabinet is the members of the executive branch that help the president, like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the economy, the Secretary of the Treasury, that kind of thing, right? And so Andrew Johnson, they pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act, not 10-year, but tenure, Tenure, and basically says that he has to get approval from Congress to fire someone. Andrew Johnson doesn't get approval from Congress to fire someone, and he fires someone, and they say, oh, well, now you've broken the law. And then they impeach him. They accuse him of a crime. The next step in impeachment is you have a trial, okay? And in that trial, the Senate is the one who votes. They're the jury that votes if you're guilty or not. Andrew Johnson was not found guilty, and he was not removed from office. But he only escaped removal by one vote. If one more senator had said he was guilty, he would have been removed from office, right? We've never had a president removed from office this way. Bill Clinton was impeached, but he was not removed, okay? All right, the next thing we have is the radical plan for, congressional plan for Reconstruction. So this is the second plan. In this second plan, this is going to be where the Republicans say, we're going to punish the South and get what we want. And basically, they decide that they're mad about them trying to send these Confederates to Congress. They're mad about the Black Codes, and they're going to put a stop to it. So what they decide to do is say that the South is going to have to vote for the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that if you are born here, you're a citizen. Because what the South was doing was saying that because all of the freedmen in the South were slaves before, they were born, or before the 13th Amendment, that they were not technically U.S. citizens, which Dred Scott said that, basically. Dred Scott said that if you were black, that you couldn't be a citizen of the United States when we talked about that. Well, and so then the South was saying, well, if you're not a citizen, we don't have to give you all of the same rights. Well, this amendment is going to say that if you are born in the United States, which all of the slaves at this point were born in the United States, then you are a citizen. And if you're a citizen, then you have rights, okay? And that's very, very important. Now, we said that that's still not going to solve all of the problems in the South, because they're still going to try to prevent a lot of the black men from voting, and so then they have to come back and say 15th Amendment. Now, the radical Republicans' plan is to force the South to pass the 14th and 15th Amendment. And they do that by occupying the South with the military. Remember, we said that they split up the South into military districts. We said that they sort of occupied them until they agreed to pass the 14th and the 15th Amendment. Okay? And so that's their plan. And this is just talking about them being under military rule. You don't have to know, like John Pope, the military governor of Georgia. You don't have to know any of that. Just know that they put them under military rule until they pass the 14th and 15th Amendment. All right. After Andrew Johnson's term is up, he's not going to get reelected. And so Ulysses S. Grant, becomes the next president. The general for the North in the Civil War. Makes perfect sense. Very popular, right? And one of the things that helps Ulysses S. Grant become president is the fact that he's a Republican. And also, this is going to be the first election where black men could vote. And when they would go out and vote, they would vote for the Republican candidate, the one who helped them get their freedom, right? And so Ulysses S. Grant was the guy who did it. And so he's very, very popular. And so he becomes president. And Ulysses S. Grant's going to make a deal with the South, saying that if you agree to pass the 14th and 15th Amendment, we will let you back into the Union officially. And then he said, the only people that will not get the citizenship back are those Confederate leaders, people like Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens, or Robert E. Lee, general, right? Those people are not getting their citizenship back, which doesn't necessarily mean that they were, kicked out of the United States. They just couldn't vote or serve in the military or, those kinds of things. Okay, this we got to talk about. This is obviously the Ku Klux Klan. Remember that this was started in Tennessee by a group of Confederates who were not happy about losing the Civil War, and they weren't happy about black people and white people trying to live sort of together. And so this is a group where they were specifically trying to resist Reconstruction, and that's an important idea. And basically what they would do is they would harass black people, and sort of say you couldn't live in certain areas, or, you couldn't get certain rights. They would also harass white people who were, trying to help the black people. If you were working for the Freedmen's Bureau, or if you were openly a Republican in the South, they would sort of harass you. They also didn't like a group called the Carpetbaggers. The Carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved to the South in order to sort of take advantage of the people in the South, or to make money off of the people in the South. A lot of times they would come here and buy up property for way below the value because they knew that the people who owned it before the war were probably struggling and needed money, or things like that. But the Ku Klux Klan, today we would call these people terrorists, and they are actually on, it's still kind of around today, they are on terrorist watch lists, because of the things that they would do. They would, have meetings at night where they would burn crosses, in people's yards, and then they would get violent. They would do something that we call lynching, which typically means like hanging, right? That's sort of what it's most associated with. But really, a lynching is sort of mob violence. It's where they would, go after somebody, that they didn't like, okay? And so this is an organization where they were trying to help sort of prevent Reconstruction. They were trying to punish the Republicans. They were trying to scare people that were trying to help the freedmen. And you want to know that they also wanted to get Democrats back in control of the government, because remember, the Democrats at the time were sort of the old Confederates, I guess. Grant is famous for fighting against the Ku Klux Klan. He actually used the military to fight against them. He passes a couple laws, like the Force Act says he's going to use the military. The Civil Rights Act says that he's going to use like the courts to, make sure that these people are found guilty when they're accused of crimes. So they might have the trials in different locations so that the people in the towns who might agree with them wouldn't vote to let the people go. Lots of different things. So the Ku Klux Klan, Grant is actually going to break up the Ku Klux Klan, and they're kind of going to go away in history a little bit. But they come back in 1915, and the reason why they come back in 1915 is because World War I starts, and so we have a huge influx of European immigrants coming into the United States to escape the war, and these people are going to bring with them different religions, different skin colors, different languages, and the Ku Klux Klan is not going to like that. And so the Ku Klux Klan in 1915, they're going to not just go against black people, they're also going to go against Jews and Catholics and lots of different groups besides just, the same as the older version of the Klan. So that's going to be important for us later. We'll learn about them again in World War I. But I did want you to know that, that they go away because of Grant, but then they're not actually gone from history, right? Civil War amendments, you have to know these. 13th Amendment ends slavery. 14th Amendment we call citizenship, is birthright citizenship. If you are born here, you're a citizen. If you're a citizen, you have rights, okay? 15th Amendment grants black men the right to vote, says that you cannot be denied the right to vote based on race or previous condition of servitude. So, just because you used to be a slave doesn't mean you can't vote, okay? All right, we're going to skip the short answer question. We're going to go to this. So this is a story specific to Georgia that you do need to know. This is talking about how there were some black men elected to Congress, 32 of them, in 1867, which would have been right as Georgia was sort of reforming its government after the Civil War. And what happens is, 15th Amendment happened. The black men can vote, they can run for office, and they were elected. Except by the time they were sworn in, just a few days later, they all get kicked out of the government. And this turns into a mess because there's riots, there's fighting, there's people being beaten up and murdered. And basically what happens is the white legislatures in Georgia did not like the fact that these 32 black men were elected, and they start saying that they were not fit to serve. And when they were sort of explaining why, these are the answers that they got down here. They said because they are a person of color, which means just because of the color of their skin. They are non-citizens, which was not true, because remember, the 14th Amendment made these people officially citizens. They were illiterate, which I can't say for sure that none of them were illiterate, but the idea behind that would be that, if they couldn't read very well, it would have been because of slavery and the fact that they weren't allowed to learn to read or write. But a lot of them could. Probably all of these men could if they were smart enough to get themselves elected to Congress. But this was just a way to sort of criticize these men and make others feel like they shouldn't be able to serve. And then this is the worst one of these. They're all horrible, but this is the worst one because they started giving what they called extreme judges of character, meaning, they started accusing these men of crimes they didn't commit, things like forgery. One guy was a post worker. They said that he had been stealing mail. Some of these men were accused of rape and of theft and counterfeiting, making fake money. And so a lot of these men were put in jail or, things like that for crimes they didn't commit, right? If you look right here, you need to know this guy's name. He's going to pop up in the next unit too. This is Rufus Bullock. He was sort of the last Republican governor of Georgia for a really long time. He was elected during Reconstruction, and he basically put his neck out and said, hey, we shouldn't kick these men out of Congress. And what happens is the Congress does something that they call censored or censor. And basically they say that, Rufus Bullock, be quiet. We're not going to listen to you. And so they do not let these men back into Congress. And we said that this is important because it leads to something called disenfranchisement. So let me write this down here just in case you were absent. Disenfranchise. And basically what this means is that it's this feeling like you don't count or you don't matter. And in this instance, it was political disenfranchisement. A lot of black people in the South are going to feel like their vote or their voice doesn't matter because of the way that these black legislatures were treated. And so Basically, this is going to, really sort of hurt the politics of Georgia for a really long time and lead to sort of a political division because of this. If you look right here, some of those representatives, it says that they were beaten. Alf Richardson, it says, was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan, and then others were arrested. So this was a horrible situation that really sort of hurt Georgia politics for a long time. Okay, that's the end of the video. I hope this helps. Good luck on the quiz tomorrow. If you have any questions, shoot me an email.